So now we have our elevation data for Scotland combined into a single file. The black areas of the raster correspond to low elevation values, around about with the lowest value being -70, as you can see, and the white areas correspond to the highest elevation, and the highest elevation being 1332 meters high. So this image is functional, but it's not very pretty and a not very intuitive way of looking at elevation data. So let's format our map into something a bit more pretty. So we right click our layer, we choose properties, and then we can go into Symbology. And in Symbology, we can leave it as stretched, that is fine. Stretched will make the numeric values in the raster file correspond to a color scale, and it will try to sort of stretch the data to fit that. The alternatives are classified, where we would define certain classes of elevation or classes of our numerical values, and we'd give those a color which could be useful if specific values in your dataset were of particular relevance, or if we were dealing with categorical data. But for elevation, which really just goes from low to high, stretched is probably the most meaningful way to visualize that data. And the current color scheme stretches it from black for the low values to white for the high values, which is practical but not very intuitive for elevation. So let's find something a bit more applicable to elevation. And most topographic maps will use some kind of scheme where there is where we have greenish values for the lowest values, green for the valleys, and then going to a brown, and then gray for the mountains, and then white for the peaks. So this seems to be pretty close to what I would have in mind. So we'll pick that one, and we'll use that. And if we click apply, we can see what it looks like. Well, it's not quite done it quite right. So and that's partially depends on how the color map is stretched to correspond with the elevation values. And the stretch here, it's now currently set to standard deviations. Let's just make it stretch the color map from the minimum value in the dataset to the maximum value. So it will stretch from -70 meters to 1332 meters. So let's set it to that and click apply. That looks a bit more meaningful, but it's not quite there. Our peaks are missing out a little bit. So we can see if we can change this a little bit. So histogram equalize, and we'll try to display as much of the information available as possible. What does this look like? Looks nice, but it's not quite what we had in mind. So let's go back to let's do maximum, minimum. Anything we can change here? Let's do percent clip. Let's clip, say 2% on both sides. What do we get? It's starting to look better. But there's, to my taste, there's still a bit too much white. So let's make this clip value here a bit smaller. Maybe here a bit bigger. Yeah, that's starting to look more like it. And what we can also add a hill shade effect, which will shade the terrain, and especially for elevation models, that's a very appropriate effect, and will make it much easier for a typical human brain to understand this. So let's just apply this to our data set and see what we get. And we get a much nicer looking map. So let's zoom in a little bit, and that's fairly intuitive.